welcome to the deep dive. You asked us to really get into Dr. Charles Finch III's work on African medicine, so that's what we're doing today.
Yeah, we've got his book, African Medicine, A Spirit Science Out of the Shadows, some commentaries he's written, stuff from his website, a press release, quite a bit to work with.
Right, and our mission basically is to unpack his main argument. This idea that African medicine is a holistic spirit science.
With roots tracing way back to ancient Egypt, but still very much alive and relevant today.
Exactly. And we should probably warn you, there are some pretty fascinating, maybe even surprising ideas in here.
Definitely. I mean, right off the bat, Finch makes this really strong case for a long, continuous history of African medical practice.
Starting in ancient Egypt in the Nile Valley, you mean?
Yes, exactly. He's basically saying that the core medical concepts you find across Africa today, their earliest documented forms are found right there in that ancient civilization.
And it's not just a vague Egypt reference either. He brings up Imhotep, right?
He does, often called the world's first documented physician.
So that immediately, challenges the usual story about where medicine officially began, suggests much older African origins.
Precisely. And he goes further looking at the timeline of these Nile Valley cultures.
Okay.
He's proposing that, well, major scientific leaps happened thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years before dynastic Egypt as we usually think of it.
Wow, okay. Tens of thousands.
Yeah, he cites his own research, but also scholars like Gerald Massey pointing towards a history maybe 40,000 years old or even older.
40,000 years.
Yeah.
That really does make you rethink the standard timeline for, human intellectual development, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, Finch also talks about some let's call them controversial recent finds in Egypt.
Oh, like what?
These really deep cylinder-shaped structures they found underground. Also things like water erosion patterns on very old stones, salt deposits.
And he sees these as evidence for
a much, much longer history of advanced civilization there. He links it to things like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, an old medical text that itself refers to even older sources.
But you said controversial.
Well, yeah. He acknowledges that, many mainstream Egyptologists look at that same evidence and come to very different conclusions about age and significance.
Got it. So he's presenting an alternative interpretation based on this physical evidence.
Right. And this ties into his point about the timeline. If his interpretation holds, it suggests, well, highly advanced societies were around much earlier than we generally accept.
Which would, I guess, rewrite the origins of science, math, medicine, putting Africa right at the start.
Potentially, yes. And he also questions the sharp line often drawn between pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt.
How so?
He argues the earlier period wasn't necessarily primitive. It might have had, different kinds of major achievements, especially in building and scientific knowledge that we're maybe just starting to recognize.
Okay, this is really shifting the perspective. And then there's the astronomy connection.
Ah, yes, the precession of the equinoxes.
That's the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. Takes about 26,000 years.
That's the one. Finch argues the ancient Nile Valley folks knew about this, which implies, incredibly long-term observation and pretty sophisticated tracking.
Right. That's not something you figure out overnight. How might knowing about these huge cosmic cycles have, influenced how I thought about health?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. Maybe seeing those vast cycles fostered a worldview centered on balance, interconnectedness on a huge scale.
And that could translate down to health within the body, its relation to the environment, maybe even the cosmos.
It's certainly possible, following his line of thought. And he even draws a line from this ancient Nile Valley knowledge to the Dogon people in Mali.
The Dogon? How do they connect?
He suggests a possible migration westward from the Nile Valley, maybe around 550 AD, possibly triggered by the closing of the Temple of Isis at Philae.
Huh. So suggesting a kind of continuity or spread of these knowledge systems across the continent.
Exactly, a thread running through history.
Okay, so we have this deep history, this potential spread.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the core idea, spirit science. What exactly does Finch mean by that term?
Well, when he says spirit science, it's not like he's dismissing observation or the physical. It's more about expanding the picture.
Expanding it how?
To include spiritual, energetic factors as real influences on health. He's arguing these ancient healers understood interconnectedness on a profound level.
So realizing that a person's health isn't just, the physical machine, but also their emotions, community ties, spiritual life, all it.
Precisely. He suggests these physician priests, as he sometimes calls them, worked with knowledge that goes beyond what modern science currently measures or even recognizes.
So the link between medicine and, say, religion or ceremony wasn't just tacked on, it was fundamental.
Absolutely central in his view. Healing wasn't just about herbs or setting bones. It often involved rituals aimed at restoring harmony on, well, on multiple levels, spiritual, communal, physical.
Yeah, and he provides some evidence for this continuing today.
Yeah, he includes fieldwork in the book, this Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices survey he did with healers in Fittek, Senegal. He sees it as kind of contemporary validation of this holistic spiritual understanding being alive and well.
Which is striking, isn't it, that these indigenous healing ways are still vibrant all across Africa, often right alongside modern clinics.
It is, and Finch pushes back hard against the tendency, especially in the West, to just write these traditions off as, superstition or quaint folklore.
He wants them recognized as a
As
science.
a sophisticated science, yeah. With its own logic, its own understanding of the world. It's about reclaiming that history, but also seeing how dismissing it has maybe limited our own understanding.
And this ties into a bigger picture of reclaiming African history and identity, right?
Yeah.
He makes specific points about ancient Egypt, or Kemet.
He strongly argues that the people of Kemet were indigenous Black Africans,
Yeah.
and that they saw the South deeper into Africa as the origin place, the source. He even mentions their reverence for the Batwa, or Dang, as the oldest people.
That's a significant claim about identity.
It is. And another key point he makes is that a lot of what we call ancient Egypt is actually geographically in modern-day Sudan,
Right.
and that the population in Egypt today largely comes from, well, later waves of people, invaders, and migrants, rather than being direct descendants of those ancient Kemites.
So that really reframes the whole history and geography we usually learn.
It definitely requires a reevaluation, yeah, of
Yeah.
Egyptian identity itself and its connection to the rest of Africa.
He even created an oath, didn't he? The Oath of Sunu.
Yes, as a kind of Kemetic-rooted alternative to the Hippocratic Oath.
Wow. That really shows a commitment to bringing these ancient principles forward, making them relevant now.
It really does. And just to give listeners a bit more context on Finch himself,
Good idea.
he's a physician, but also a respected scholar and historian, written several other books, Echoes of the Old Darkland, The Star of Deep Beginnings, Nile Valley Civilization.
So he's been working in this area for a long time.
Oh, yeah. He's really seen as a leading voice in African-centered history and thought. His work seems driven by this mission to help reconnect people of African descent with this deep intellectual and spiritual heritage.
And this latest book, African Medicine, it's partly a re-release.
Yeah, it collects and expands on earlier essays, showing how relevant his thinking continues to be.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive here,
Mm-hmm.
we've really explored Dr. Finch's core argument, African medicine as a spirit science,
Right, with incredibly ancient roots in Egypt and the Nile Valley.
a truly holistic approach.
Yeah.
Physical, emotional, spiritual, all woven together.
And fundamentally challenging a lot of conventional Western ideas about medical history, about ancient Africa's sophistication, and even about identity.
Absolutely. And if you're listening because you want to be well-informed, Finch's work really pushes you to think about the history of medicine differently.
And about that interconnectedness, mind, body, spirit, which seems so central to these ancient traditions, and maybe something we're only just starting to rediscover in modern wellness.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Could truly understanding these ancient perspectives actually offer valuable insights for healthcare today? And maybe even for how we understand our shared human story?
It's definitely a provocative thought to leave people with. Exploring Finch's work directly might be the next step if this has sparked your interest.
A lot to think about. Thanks for digging deep with us today.